The vibration in the deck plating of the Varix Prime was a steady 60 Hz hum. It was the sound of a machine built for a singular purpose. High Strategist Kelran stood at the center of the command nexus. He did not look at a throne. He looked at a series of data feeds. His layered chitin plates shifted slightly as the ship adjusted its orientation. The air inside the bridge was kept at a crisp 54 degrees. It was the optimal temperature for Verthi cognitive processing. Translation to Sol Space complete, Tharvek reported. Tharvek was the lead fleet coordinator. He did not waste words. Stealth suppression fields are holding at 99% efficiency. Human sensor grids show no deviation in baseline activity. Kelran focused on the primary projection. Earth sat in the center of the void like a blue marble. It looked fragile. To the Verthi, it was not a planet. It was a data set they had been solving for 100 years. They had intercepted every radio wave. They had mapped every undersea cable. They had archived every internal war. Begin the final synchronization, Kelran ordered. Archivist Talon stepped forward from the data alcove. He held a tablet that contained the distilled essence of a century of study. The models are refreshed. We have accounted for the last 5 years of human aerospace development. Their orbital defense grid is fragmented. National interests prevent them from a unified response. Probability of a decisive collapse within 90 seconds remains at 98%. Kelran watched the numbers. He liked numbers. They were cold. They did not lie. The coalition had spent 100 years preparing because humans were known for tactical noise. Humans were messy. They were unpredictable in small, irritating ways. The Verthi did not like mess. They liked systems. 3 primary strike carriers are in position, Tharvek said. 12 heavy cruisers are flanking the lunar shadow. 100 assault transports are fueled and ready for atmospheric entry. We are waiting for your mark. The bridge was silent. The only sound was the low-frequency drone of the life support systems. Kelran checked the thermal signatures of the fleet. Everything was green. This was the culmination of 3 generations of Verthi military engineering. They had built environmental chambers to simulate Earth's gravity. They had run 10 million hours of combat simulations. They knew the humans better than the humans knew themselves. Commence Phase 1, Kelran said. The Varix Prime shuddered as it dropped the stealth shroud. Across the fleet, precision beams fired. They were targeting the human satellite clusters. These were the eyes of the planet. In the Verthi models, the destruction of these nodes would lead to immediate global panic. Communications would fail. Command structures would blind themselves. Impact in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. On the projection, dozens of human satellites vanished. They were turned into expanding clouds of debris. Targeting successful, Talon reported. Human transmissions are spiking. We are seeing a massive increase in emergency protocols across all terrestrial frequencies. Kelran leaned closer to the display. This was the moment of the initial shock. According to the archives, the humans should be scrambling. They should be sending unencrypted distress signals. They should be trying to reboot their centralized networks. Commence cyber disruption, Kelran ordered. Inject the isolation algorithms into their primary hubs. I want their world dark before we hit the atmosphere. The Verthi infiltration programs were masterpieces of logic. They had been designed to mimic human coding structures, then dismantle them from the inside. They were supposed to propagate through the global internet in less than 12 seconds. Talon's recessed eyes flickered behind his translucent membranes. He tapped his console. Algorithm deployed. Infiltration is stalled. Kelran turned his head. Stalled? Explain. The human systems are not attempting to fight the virus, Talon said. His voice was steady, but there was a new cadence to it. They are partitioning. As soon as a node detects our signature, it severs all physical and wireless connections to the rest of the network. They are cutting their own limbs off to stop the infection. This was not in the primary model. They are isolating themselves? Kelran asked. That leaves them without a central command. It makes the invasion easier. No, Talon replied. It makes them autonomous. We are no longer fighting one network. We are fighting 10,000 independent ones. Tharvek interrupted. High strategist. Orbital defense platforms are emerging from the lunar shadow. They were not on the long-term scans. Kelrin looked at the tactical map. New icons were appearing. They were small, heavily armored, and cold. They had been hidden in debris fields. They had been masked by the very satellite wreckage the Verthi had just created. Identify those platforms, Kelrun commanded. Compact railgun arrays, Tharvek said. They are firing. Projectile velocity is 30% higher than our estimates. The Verix Prime groaned. A kinetic slug slammed into the forward shields. The vibration was violent. It rattled the chitin on Kelrun's chest. Shields at 84%, Tharvek reported. The cruiser Havrik has lost its primary sensor array. They are taking concentrated fire from 3 different vectors. Kelrun maintained his composure. This was a deviation, but the coalition was built for adaptation. Adjust shield harmonics. Deploy suppression drones to neutralize those platforms. Move the assault transports to the entry corridors. We do not need the network to take the ground. The invasion had been underway for less than 3 minutes. Assault transports are advancing, Tharvek said. Human craft are launching from dispersed points. They are not forming intercept patterns. They are ignoring our cruisers. They are targeting the logistics vessels. Kelrun watched as a human kinetic barrage struck a fuel carrier in the rear formation. The explosion was a silent bloom of white light on the screen. They are skipping the front line, Kelrun observed. He felt a strange sensation in his primary cooling duct. It was not fear. It was the realization that the archives were missing something. They are not defending their sky. They are attacking our endurance. High strategist, Talon said, his voice dropping an octave. I am monitoring local human tactical transmissions. They are not using a global directive. They are using decentralized decision trees. Every unit is acting as its own commander. Kelrun looked at the blue planet. It no longer looked fragile. It looked like a hornet's nest that had been poked with a very expensive stick. They knew we would hack the center, Kelrun said quietly, so they removed the center before we arrived. Probability of success is dropping, Talon reported. 92% no, 91. Continue the descent, Kelrun ordered. We have trained for a century. We do not stop for a 3% deviation. Launch the first wave. The transports dived toward the atmosphere. The real war was supposed to happen on the ground, but as the first ships hit the thermosphere, the ground began to fire back. Not from military bases, from everywhere. The heat of atmospheric entry was a physical weight. Inside the lead assault transport, designated the Krivan, the internal temperature climbed to 88 degrees. The cooling units hummed at maximum capacity. High strategist Kelrun watched the telemetry from the bridge of the Verix Prime. On his screen, the Krivan was a glowing red icon cutting through the thermosphere. Behind it, 119 similar icons followed in a rigid diamond-shaped formation. This was the formation they had practiced in the simulators for 30 years. It was mathematically perfect for overlapping shield coverage. Atmospheric friction is exceeding projections by 12%, Tharvek reported. His fingers moved across the glass interface with clinical precision. The humans have seeded the upper atmosphere with high-density metallic dust. It is increasing the thermal load on our leading edges. Kelrun narrowed his recessed eyes. A passive defense. Crude. It will not stop the descent. It is not meant to stop us, Archivist Talon countered. He was staring at a secondary data stream. The dust is ionizing. It is creating a massive localized blackout. Our short-range sensors are being blinded by the very heat we are generating. We are flying into the clouds with zero visibility. The vibration on the Verix Prime changed. It was no longer the steady hum of the engines. It was the shudder of the ship's primary railgun batteries swiveling to engage new targets. Multiple launches detected from the North American landmass, Tharvek announced. They are not coming from known silos. Heat signatures are emerging from commercial rail yards and industrial zones. Kelrun watched the tactical map. The blue planet was suddenly covered in thousands of tiny yellow sparks. Intercept them. We are trying, Tharvek said. His voice remained sober, but his movements were faster now. The projectiles are non-ballistic. They are maneuvering on irregular flight paths. They are using cold gas thrusters to mask their final vectors. Our point defense algorithms are struggling to lock. One of the yellow sparks on the screen merged with a red icon. The Kryvon's telemetry went flat. "The Kryvon is gone," Talon said. His voice was flat. "Direct hit on the primary gravitic dampener. The ship is tumbling. It will break up before it hits the 10,000-foot mark." Kelrin did not mourn the loss. He looked for the cause. How did a commercial-grade launch site achieve a terminal lock on a stealth-shielded transport? "They are not using radar," Talon replied. He pulled up a captured signal fragment. "They are using a distributed optical network. Thousands of low-cost cameras on the ground are linked together. They are triangulating our heat signatures against the stars. We cannot jam their eyes, because their eyes are everywhere." On the ground, the reality was a symphony of mechanical violence. In a disguised shipping container outside of a suburb in Ohio, Brevin Stroud watched a monitor. He was a logistics coordinator for the regional defense grid. He was not a soldier in a traditional sense. He was a man who knew how to move freight and manage data. He had spent the last 20 years preparing for this 10-minute window. He didn't need to give a speech. He just clicked a confirmation box on his screen. The accept button was worn from years of drills. She made it clear she was not leaving her post, his supervisor had told him over the comms earlier. He didn't argue. Everyone had a job to do. Across the continent, thousands of men like Brevin were doing the same thing. They weren't waiting for a president to tell them to fire. They were following a pre-programmed logic gate. If the sky turns red, you release the hounds. Back on the Verix Prime, the air was growing heavy with the smell of recycled oxygen and ozone. "Success probability is at 86%, Talon reported. "The loss of the Kryvon has disrupted the diamond formation. The remaining transports are exposed. Shift to a staggered column vector," Kelrin ordered. "And tell the ground commanders to prioritize the destruction of those optical nodes. Use the orbital lasers." "We cannot," Tharvek said. "The metallic dust in the atmosphere is scattering the laser beams. We are essentially firing into a mirror. The energy is reflecting back into the upper ionosphere. We are blinding our own orbital sensors." Kelrin felt a tightening in his chitinous plates. The sensation was a biological response to a problem that had no immediate engineering solution. The Verthi had spent a century studying human war. They had read the books. They had watched the footage of the world wars. They had modeled the nuclear doctrines. But the humans they were fighting now were not the humans from the archives. These humans had spent that same century knowing they were being watched. "They played the long game," Talon whispered. He looked at the high strategist. "Every war they fought in the last 50 years. They were holding back. They were showing us the tactics they wanted us to archive. They were feeding our models a lie." "A century of data," Kelrin said. "Wasted." "Not wasted," Tharvek interrupted. "Just obsolete. We are entering the 6-minute mark. The second wave of transports is hitting the lower atmosphere." The screen flashed. 3 more red icons vanished. "What happened?" Kelrin demanded. "The humans have activated low-altitude kinetic interceptors," Tharvek said. "They are essentially telephone poles made of tungsten, launched by electromagnetic rails. No explosives, just pure mass. They are striking the transports at Mach 7. The vibration in the deck plating intensified. The Verix Prime was now taking fire from the lunar shadow platforms they had failed to neutralize earlier. The ship groaned under the stress of the kinetic impacts. "Shield harmonics are failing," Tharvek reported. "The human platforms are firing in a specific frequency. They are hitting our shields at the exact millisecond they pulse for cooling. They have solved our refresh rate." Kelrin looked at the archivist. "How could they know our shield refresh rate? That is a classified engineering specification." Talon looked at his tablet. His membranes flickered. "They didn't steal the data, High Strategist. They calculated it. They have been firing low-yield probes at our deep space scouts for 20 years. We thought it was just debris or primitive testing. They were measuring the bounce back. They were timing us. The bridge lights flickered to a dim emergency red. The temperature began to rise. The cooling system was failing. "We are losing the initiative," Kelrin said. His voice was no longer the voice of a conqueror. It was the voice of a man realizing he was trapped in a room with a predator he thought was a specimen. "Order the cruisers to descend. We need their heavy cannons within the atmosphere. We have to burn the ground. If we bring the cruisers down, they will be vulnerable to the same railgun arrays," Tharvek warned. "The gravity well will limit our mobility. We will be sitting targets." "We are already sitting targets," Kelrin snapped. "Execute the descent. We will settle this with raw power." As the massive cruisers began to tilt their noses toward the blue horizon, the Earth responded. It wasn't a shout, it was a hum. Across every continent, the power grid surged. The humans weren't just defending. They were powering up something the Verthi hadn't even named yet. "Energy spike detected on the surface," Talon said, his voice trembling. "It's not coming from a weapon. It's coming from the entire planetary infrastructure. They are turning the world into a circuit." Kelrin watched the screen. The 7-minute mark was approaching. The air in the bridge was now 65 degrees and rising. "Brace for impact," Tharvek said. The Verix Prime shook as if the hand of a god had slammed into its hull. The sound was a low-frequency roar that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the bone. "Report!" Kelrin shouted. "We just lost the Havrik," Tharvek said, "and the Verix Prime. We are venting atmosphere. The humans didn't fire a missile. They just hit us with a focused pulse of microwave energy. It cooked our internal electronics." The archives were silent. The models were dead. The invasion was 8 minutes old, and the coalition was bleeding. The air in the command nexus tasted of burnt insulation and recycled nitrogen. It was a dry, metallic flavor that signaled the death of a machine. High Strategist Kelrin felt the heat rising through the soles of his boots. The floor plating was no longer vibrating with the steady 60 Hz hum of a healthy ship. It was shuddering in irregular, violent jerks. "Internal cooling is offline for decks 12 through 40, Tharvek reported. His voice was strained. He was fighting a console that flickered with ghost data. The microwave pulse did more than fry the sensors. It fused the secondary relay junctions. We cannot vent the heat from the reactor core." Kelrin watched the primary display. It was a mosaic of static and red warning icons. The Havrik, a heavy cruiser that had survived 3 planetary subjugations in the last 50 years, was a cloud of expanding debris. It had not been destroyed by a missile. It had been dismantled by a coordinated strike of kinetic slugs and high-frequency energy. "The humans are not using a centralized power grid," Archivist Talon said. He was hunched over a backup terminal. His translucent membranes were cloudy with stress. "Our models assumed they would protect their primary generators. They did the opposite. They turned every localized substation into a node for a planetary-scale phased array. The entire planet is a weapon, Kelrin. They are using the transcontinental fiber optic lines as a massive antenna. They are improvising with their own infrastructure," Kelrin said. He gripped the edge of the command table. The metal was hot to the touch. "This was not in the century of data. We watched them build those grids. We watched them fight over coal and oil and lithium. They never once tested a planetary-scale microwave emitter." "They didn't have to test it," Tharvek interrupted. "They just had to calculate the math. They waited until we were in the upper ionosphere. We provided the target. The atmosphere provided the medium. They used our own shield harmonics against us. On the tactical map, a new series of contacts appeared. They were small, fast. They were launching from dispersed sites in the American Midwest and the Siberian tundra. These were not the standard orbital interceptors the Verthi had modeled. These were older, more rugged designs. Mobile railgun platforms, Talon identified. Designation MRGES. They are mounted on heavy-duty rail cars. They are moving at 80 miles per hour along civilian freight lines. We cannot lock onto them. By the time our targeting computers solve the ballistic trajectory, the platform has moved 3 miles. Kelrin looked at the sensor feed from a surviving drone. He saw a human technician, a man named Nolan Strake. though the Verthi did not know his name yet. Strake was standing on the deck of a lunar shadow platform. He wasn't wearing a high-tech combat suit. He was wearing heavy canvas coveralls and a pressurized helmet that looked 50 years old. Strake was manual loading a tungsten slug into a breech. He wasn't waiting for a computer to give him a green light. He was using a physical sight. The human pulled a lever. A streak of white light left the platform. 2 seconds later, the Verix Prime groaned. A tungsten rod the size of a telephone pole punched through the outer hull of the starboard hangar. It didn't explode. It didn't need to. It was traveling at Mach 7. The kinetic energy alone turned the hangar's atmosphere into plasma. "Hangar Bay 3 is gone," Tharvek said. His voice was flat, pragmatic. The shock had passed into a cold realization of mortality. "We have lost 64% of our atmospheric dropcraft. The soldiers inside were killed by the pressure wave. They never even saw the surface." "Why are they not aiming for the bridge?" Kelran asked. He was a strategist. He understood the value of a decapitation strike. "They have the accuracy. They could end this command structure now." Talon looked up from his tablet. "They don't want to kill you, Kelran. They want to disable the fleet. They are targeting our locomotion and our logistics. They are treating us like a broken engine. They are stripping the parts they don't like." The bureaucracy of the Verthi coalition was its greatest strength in a long war. It was its greatest weakness in a 10-minute fight. Every command Kelran issued had to be verified by 3 sub-commanders. Every tactical shift required a data integrity check. The humans, meanwhile, were operating on what appeared to be total autonomy. "We are receiving a localized transmission from the surface," Tharvek said. "It is not a surrender. It is a technical broadcast. They are sending us our own engineering schematics, specifically the cooling cycles for our heavy cruisers." Kelran felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rising temperature. "They are showing us that they know how we work." "No," Talon corrected. "They are showing us that they have found a flaw in our cooling cycles. Look at the energy readings from the North Atlantic." On the screen, the ocean was boiling in a perfect circle. A series of underwater acoustic emitters were firing at a frequency that matched the Verix Prime's internal vibration. It was a resonance attack. The deck plating began to howl. It was a high-pitched metallic scream that set Kelran's teeth on edge. The vibration was shaking the bolts loose from the bulkheads. "The ship is shaking itself apart," Tharvek shouted over the noise. "We have to change our internal frequency. We have to recalibrate the dampeners." "We can't," Talon said. "The dampeners are controlled by the central logic core. The logic core is fused from the microwave pulse. We are locked into this frequency." Kelran looked at the countdown. 8 minutes and 40 seconds had passed since they translated into Sol space. A century of preparation had been dismantled in 520 seconds. "Order the remaining cruisers to fire their primary beams at the North Atlantic coordinates," Kelran commanded. "If we cannot stop the resonance, we will evaporate the source." "The cruisers are not responding, High Strategist," Tharvek said. "The human cyber warfare units didn't try to take over our ships. They didn't try to steal our codes. They just flooded our communication bands with white noise and high-definition images of their own history. Our processors are choked. They are trying to archive 1 billion gigabytes of human war footage every second. The system is overwhelmed." Kelran looked at the image of Earth. It was no longer a blue marble. It was a jagged, angry spark in the dark. The humans hadn't just survived the invasion. They had turned the invasion into a diagnostic test for their own defense systems. "They aren't fighting a war," Kelran whispered. "They are running a stress test, and we are the hardware." A massive jolt threw Kelran against the command table. The Verix Prime had just lost its primary thruster array. The ship began to tilt. The blue horizon of Earth started to slide upward on the view screen. "Gravity well is pulling us in," Tharvek said. He didn't look up. He was bracing himself against his console. "Atmospheric entry in 60 seconds. We don't have enough power to maintain orbit." Kelran closed his eyes for a brief moment. He thought of the war archives back home. He thought of the millions of hours spent simulating this day. They had accounted for everything except the human ability to turn a tool into a weapon and a weapon into a tool. Tell the fleet to prepare for emergency landing, Kelrin said. There is no landing, High Strategist, Talon said. There is only impact. The Varix Prime groaned. It was a sound of stressed titanium and failing welds. The ship was no longer a conqueror. It was a 900,000-ton brick falling toward a gravity well. The deck tilted at a sharp 15-degree angle. Kelrin gripped the edge of the command table. His talons left deep gouges in the synthetic surface. The vibration from the North Atlantic resonance attack had moved from a hum to a bone-shaking roar. It was a low-frequency assault. It bypassed the ears and vibrated the internal organs. Structural integrity in the lower decks is failing, Tharvek shouted. He was strapped into his seat. His fingers flew across a flickering console. The resonance is hitting the natural frequency of our primary support struts. If we do not change our mass distribution, the ship will snap in half before we hit the stratosphere. Kelrin looked at the monitors. They were flooded with human war footage. Black and white images of ancient trenches, grainy video of nuclear tests, high-definition feeds of modern drone strikes. It was a digital landslide. The Verthi logic cores were designed to categorize information. They could not stop. They were trying to index the entire history of human violence while the ship burned. Ignore the data, Kelrin barked. Sever the link to the primary archives. We are operating on manual. Now. In the engineering sub-level, Arlen Whitrox fought the heat. The air was 62 degrees and rising. For a Verthi, it felt like a furnace. Arlen was the chief of drive maintenance. He didn't care about the politics of the invasion. He cared about the 3 massive plasma turbines that were currently choking on their own exhaust. He shoved a manual override tool into a jammed vent. The tool was a heavy wrench made of a dense alloy. It was a blue-collar solution to a high-tech nightmare. He turned the wrench with everything he had. The vent hissed. A cloud of superheated steam sprayed into the compartment. Arlen didn't flinch. He adjusted his ocular membranes to filter the mist. He could see the turbine blades. They were glowing a dull, angry red. The human cyber attack had locked the cooling valves in the closed position. It was a simple, brutal move. Bridge, this is Whitrox, he grunted into his comms. The cooling cycle is dead. I am manually venting the secondary loops. If I don't get more pressure in 30 seconds, the turbines will liquefy. Tell Tharvek to stop fighting the pitch and start bleeding off velocity with the maneuvering thrusters. On the bridge, Ivara Lorne was handling the internal communications. She made it clear that the engineering deck was on the verge of total collapse. She reported that the heat was becoming lethal for the crew in the lower sections. Kelrin heard the report. He didn't have time for sympathy. He had a ship to save. Tharvek, follow Whitrox's lead, Kelrin ordered. Forget the landing protocols. We need to maximize drag. Use the hull as a brake. The heat shields aren't rated for that angle, Tharvek replied. His voice was tight. We will burn up over the Atlantic. We are already burning, Kelrin said. The ship hit the upper atmosphere. The Varix Prime shuddered as it slammed into the thin air. Outside the view screen, the sky turned from black to a bruised purple. Then it turned orange. A sheath of white-hot plasma began to wrap around the nose of the carrier. The sound changed. The metallic screaming was replaced by the roar of atmospheric friction. It was the sound of a world pushing back. Talon looked up from a secondary screen. His membranes were flickering rapidly. High Strategist, the humans are not firing. The railgun platforms in orbit have ceased their bombardment. Kelrin narrowed his eyes. Why? They are tracking us, Talon said. They have cleared the airspace over the eastern seaboard of the North American continent. They are not trying to destroy us in the air, they are guiding us down. A kill box, Kelrin whispered. The realization was a cold weight in his chest. The humans weren't just defending their planet, they were managing the crash site. They had calculated the trajectory of the Varix Prime. They knew exactly where it would land. They were treating the Verthi flagship like a piece of hazardous waste that needed to be deposited in a specific location. Adjust the thrusters, Kelrin commanded. We need to overshoot their predicted landing zone. If they want us in one spot, we go to another. We can't, Tharvek said. He pointed to the navigation display. The human orbital platforms are firing low-yield kinetic slugs. They aren't hitting the hull. They are hitting the air in front of us. They are creating high-pressure pockets that are forcing our nose down. They are steering us, Kelran. We are on a leash. The ship plummeted. The altimeter spun downward. 50 miles. 40 miles. The Varix Prime was a streak of fire across the sky. In the engineering bay, Arlen Whitrox felt the floor groan. A support beam buckled 3 feet from his head. The resonance attack from the ocean below was getting stronger as they got closer to the source. The ship was vibrating so hard that the Virthi crew members were losing their balance. Arlen grabbed a safety rail. He saw the coolant pipes vibrating. They looked like they were made of rubber. 30 seconds to turbine failure, he shouted into his comms. On the bridge, the primary view screen flickered. The human war footage finally stopped. It was replaced by a single line of text in the Virthi language. The translation was perfect. It was a bureaucratic notification. Zone 4, clearance granted. Welcome to the surface. They are mocking us, Tharvek hissed. No, Kelran said. They are documenting us. This is a controlled experiment. The Varix Prime cleared the cloud layer. Below them, the Atlantic Ocean was a churning mass of white foam. In the center of the chaos sat a series of massive floating structures. They were not military ships. They were industrial platforms. They were the source of the resonance. Brace for impact, Kelran shouted. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at the deck. He thought about the 100 years of preparation, the simulations, the drills, the certainty. It all felt like a dream. The reality was the heat, the vibration, and the terrifying speed of the ground coming up to meet them. The ship hit the water at an angle. The impact was not a crash. It was an explosion of spray and metal. The Varix Prime skipped once across the surface like a flat stone. The inertial dampeners shrieked and then died. Kelran was thrown forward. His head hit the command table. Darkness encroached at the edges of his vision. The last thing he heard was the sound of the ocean rushing into the lower decks. It was a cold, rhythmic sound. It was the sound of the Atlantic reclaiming the debris. The invasion was 9 minutes and 42 seconds old. The Virthi had reached Earth, but they were no longer a fleet. They were a shipwreck. The darkness inside the command nexus was absolute for 3 seconds. Then, the emergency lighting kicked in. It was a harsh, rhythmic amber strobe that pulsed at the frequency of a failing heart. High strategist Kelran felt the copper taste of his own blood. It coated his mandibles. He pushed himself off the command table. The surface was slick with hydraulic fluid. The deck was tilted at a 22-degree angle. The Varix Prime was no longer a ship. It was a dying animal. The sound of the Atlantic Ocean was a low, muffled roar against the outer hull. It sounded heavy. It sounded patient. "Report," Kelran said. His voice was a dry rasp. Tharvek was slumped over his console. A shard of reinforced glass had sliced through his primary chitin plate. He didn't move. Archivist Talon was the only other one standing. He was clutching a manual override lever. His breathing was fast and shallow. "Hull integrity at 40%, Talon said. Decks 12 through 19 are fully submerged. We have lost the primary reactor. We are running on chemical cells. Total power output is at 6%. Kelran looked at the main view screen. It was cracked. A spiderweb of fractures obscured the image. Through the gaps, he saw the gray, churning water of the North Atlantic. The massive floating platforms they had seen from the air were closing in. They were not warships. They were massive, flat-topped barges equipped with heavy-duty cranes and industrial-scale pumps. "They aren't firing," Talon whispered. "They don't need to," Kelran replied. "The ocean is doing the work for them." 30 decks below, Arlen Whitrox was waist-deep in freezing salt water. The temperature was 34 degrees. It felt like 1,000 needles stabbing into his flesh. He was in Engineering Subsector 4. The air was thick with the smell of burnt insulation and ozone. Keaton Moreland, get that brace in place, Arlen shouted. Keaton was a junior technician. He was struggling with a hydraulic jack. He looked terrified. The bulkhead behind him was groaning. The pressure of the ocean at this depth was trying to turn the room into a soda can. The seal is failing, Arlen, Keaton yelled back. The salt water is hitting the cooling manifolds. If the magnesium plates ignite, this whole deck goes up. Arlen didn't answer. He didn't have time for a conversation. He grabbed a heavy-duty welding torch from his belt. He kicked a floating crate out of his way. The water was rising. It was at his chest now. He could hear the sound of the ship's internal skeleton snapping. It was a series of sharp metallic pops. He reached the manifold. The metal was glowing a dull red despite the freezing water. Steam hissed around him, blinding him. He felt for the emergency bypass valve. It was jammed. He took a heavy wrench from his thigh holster and hammered at the valve handle. 1 strike, 2. On the 3rd strike, the valve turned. A slurry of fire-retardant foam sprayed into the water. It was thick and gray. It smothered the heat. The hissing stopped. Arlen leaned his head against the cold metal of the bulkhead. He was shivering violently. Elson Var made it clear we need to evacuate the lower sectors, Ari, Keaton said. He was looking at a handheld sensor. She says the humans are deploying underwater tethering lines. They are trying to stabilize the hull. Arlen wiped the grime from his eyes. They aren't stabilizing us to save us, kid. They're stabilizing us so we don't leak radiation into their fishing grounds. We're a hazardous material spill to them. Back on the bridge, Kelrin watched the human platforms. They were less than 500 yards away now. Massive mechanical arms were extending from the barges. They looked like the legs of a giant insect. He saw human figures on the decks of the platforms. They weren't wearing military uniforms. They were wearing high-visibility orange jumpsuits and heavy-duty respirators. They are boarding us, Talon said. No, Kelrin corrected. They are impounding us. A loud metallic thud vibrated through the entire ship. It was followed by the sound of grinding steel. The first tether had connected, then another. The Verix Prime shuddered as the industrial winches on the barges began to pull. They were leveling the ship. The 22-degree tilt began to decrease. Tharvik is dead, Talon said quietly. He had checked the fleet coordinator's pulse. Kelrin didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the view screen. A small, fast-moving boat was approaching the jagged hole in the Verix Prime's bow. It was a rigid hull inflatable. There were 6 humans on board. They weren't carrying heavy plasma rifles. They were carrying scanners, breaching tools, and what looked like portable containment units. The realization hit Kelrin with the force of a kinetic slug. For 100 years, the Verthi had prepared for a war of empires. They had studied the Great Crusades. They had analyzed the world wars. They had prepared to fight a version of humanity that was obsessed with flags, territory, and glory. But the humanity that had met them in the sky was different. This humanity was professional. It was bureaucratic. It was cold. They didn't see the Verthi as an existential threat to be feared. They saw them as a technical problem to be managed, an unscheduled arrival, an environmental risk. They have breached the airlock on Deck 4, Talon reported. His voice was hollow. They are using a standard industrial plasma cutter. It took them 42 seconds to bypass our security encryption. Of course it did, Kelrin said. They've been practicing on their own deep-sea rigs for decades. Our alloy is just another grade of steel to them. The bridge door hissed. The emergency seals had been cut from the outside. The heavy metal plates slid open with a mechanical groan. 3 humans stepped onto the bridge. They moved with a practiced, methodical grace. They didn't point weapons at Kelron. They held their scanners out, mapping the room in 3 dimensions. The leader of the group was a man with graying hair and a face that looked like it was carved from granite. He looked at the dead body of Tharvik, then at Talon, and finally at Kelrin. He didn't look angry. He looked tired, like a man who had just finished a long shift and was being told he had to work overtime. He tapped a device on his wrist. A translation matrix chirped. "I am Foreman Nolan Strake," the man said. His voice was deep and steady. This sector is currently under the jurisdiction of the North Atlantic Salvage and Recovery Authority. You are in violation of 3 different maritime safety protocols and 2 Environmental Protection Acts. Kelrin stared at him. He felt the absurdity of the moment pressing down on him. We are the Verthi Coalition. We came to— I don't care why you came, Strake interrupted. He stepped forward and looked at the failing power displays. What I care about is the fact that your primary cooling core is leaking heavy isotopes into a migratory whale lane. My job is to plug that leak and get this scrap heap off the seafloor. Strake looked at his team. Check the survivors for biological contaminants. If they're clean, get them to the containment barge. And someone tell Jaron Coldrick to bring the heavy-duty pumps. We're losing buoyancy on the starboard side. Kelrin felt a strange sense of vertigo. It wasn't from the crash. It was from the total collapse of his reality. He had spent his entire life studying the art of war. He had been the architect of 100 invasions. He realized now that he wasn't a prisoner of war. He was a liability. The invasion, Kelrin said almost to himself. It lasted 10 minutes. Strake looked at him, his expression neutral. 10 minutes and 14 seconds. You set a new record for the fastest salvage claim in history. Now move. We have a schedule to keep. As the humans led Kelrin and Talon toward the exit, the high strategist looked back at the shattered bridge. The strobe light was still pulsing. The Atlantic was still roaring. And for the first time in a century, the Verthi Coalition was silent. They had prepared for a battle. They had been met with a cleanup crew. The walk from the command nexus to the airlock was a sensory assault of low-frequency vibrations. The Verix Prime was dying in a way the simulations had never predicted. It was not a clean, cinematic explosion. It was a slow, grinding surrender to gravity and salt water. Kelrin felt the deck tilt another 4 degrees to the starboard side. The sound of the Atlantic Ocean pressing against the hull was a constant rhythmic thrum. It felt like the heartbeat of a predator. Foreman Nolan Strake led the way. He did not look back to see if the high strategist was following. He knew the Verthi were following because they had nowhere else to go. Behind Kelrin, Archivist Talon stumbled. His long, narrow limbs were not designed for the erratic pitching of a flooded vessel. 2 other humans followed them. One was a younger man named Jaron Coldrick. He carried a heavy, yellow-cased diagnostic tool that hummed with a steady, reassuring drone. "Watch your step on the grating," Jaron Coldrick said. His voice was muffled by a heavy-duty respirator. "The coolant leak has made the floor slick. It will eat right through those boots of yours if you linger." Kelrin looked down. A neon-green fluid was swirling into the rising seawater. It was the blood of his ship. To him, it was a sacred substance that powered a century of dreams. To the humans, it was a chemical spill that needed to be neutralized. They passed through the secondary armory. Kelrin saw his elite warriors. They were slumped against the bulkheads. Their weapons had been confiscated and tossed into a plastic bin marked hazardous materials. A human woman in a reflective vest was spray painting a large red X on the door. She did not look at the prisoners. She made it clear through her posture that they were merely obstacles in her workspace. "What will happen to my fleet?" Kelrin asked. The translation matrix on Strake's wrist turned his clicks and whistles into flat metallic English. Strake stopped at a junction. He looked at a holographic blueprint of the ship that Jaron Coldrick projected onto the wall. "Your fleet is currently being tagged by the Coast Guard. The ships that stayed in orbit are being escorted to a parking orbit by our tugs. The ones that came down into the drink. Well, they belong to the underwriters now." "Underwriters?" Talon whispered. The word did not exist in the Verthi war archives. "Insurance, pal," Strake said. He spat a bit of flavored tobacco into the rising water. "You caused a lot of property damage in 10 minutes. Someone has to pay for the broken windows in London and the scorched cornfields in Nebraska. Your ships are the collateral." They reached the main hangar bay. The sight was devastating to Kelrin's military mind. The Verthi assault transports designed to carry the terror of the Coalition to 1,000 worlds were being hoisted by massive, greasy chains. Human heavy-lift drones, scarred by years of industrial use, were dragging the sleek vessels toward the open sea gate. A man named Brevin Stroud was standing on a floating platform near the gate. He was shouting orders into a radio. He pointed at a Verti heavy walker. A moment later, a massive hydraulic shear clamped onto the walker's primary cannon and snapped it like a dry twig. That was a Tier 1 disruptor, Kelrin said. His voice was hollow. It took 30 years to calibrate that focal lens. It's a fire hazard now, Jaron Koldrick remarked. He tapped his diagnostic tool. The power cells are leaking radiation. We can't have that sitting in the harbor. We're going to have to drain the cores and encase the whole thing in leaded concrete. The group stepped out onto a temporary gangway. The transition from the ship's interior to the open air was jarring. The Atlantic air was cold and wet. Rain lashed against Kelrin's chitinous plates. In every direction, the horizon was filled with human ships. They weren't warships, they were barges, they were crane ships, they were salvage tugs, thousands of them. The Verthi had studied Earth's military. They had counted the tanks and the jets. They had ignored the civilian machinery. Now Kelrin saw the error. The humans didn't just have a military. They had an industrial ecosystem that was larger than some of the systems the Coalition had conquered. A large, flat-bottomed barge was moored alongside the Verix Prime. On its deck sat a row of modular shipping containers. Strake gestured toward one of them. The door was open. Inside were several cots and a table with a small heater. "That's your new home for the next 48 hours, Strake said. "We'll move you to a processing center once the lawyers figure out what your legal status is. Technically, you're not even immigrants. You're just cargo that fell off a truck." Kelrin walked to the edge of the gangway and looked down at the hull of his flagship. The name Verix Prime was partially submerged. A human technician was using a high-pressure hose to scrub alien algae off the side so they could weld a towing bracket to the frame. "We spent 100 years, Kelrin said. He turned to look at Strake. 100 years of preparation. We modeled every tactical response. We accounted for every weapon in your inventory." Strake leaned against the railing of the barge. He took off his hard hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "That was your first mistake, strategist. You studied our wars. You should have studied our job sites." "I do not understand," Kelrin replied. "A war has rules," Strake said. He pointed to the thousands of humans swarming over the wreckage. "A job has a deadline. You came here looking for a fight. We just saw a massive pile of scrap metal falling from the sky. And in this economy, nobody lets 100 tons of high-grade alloy go to waste." Jaron Koldrick walked over, holding a digital clipboard. "Foreman, the primary singularity core is stabilized. We've got the containment field locked at 42%. It's safe to tow." "Good," Strake said. He looked at Kelrin one last time. "Don't feel too bad. You're the biggest thing to happen to the salvage industry since the Titanic. You're going to keep a lot of people employed for a long time." The door to the shipping container hissed shut. Kelrin sat on the edge of a cot. He felt the barge jerk as the tugboats began to pull. The Verix Prime, the pride of the Verti Coalition, was being hauled away like a broken car. Through a small reinforced window, Kelrin watched the sun begin to set over the gray Atlantic. The invasion was over. The war was settled. There were no treaties to sign. There were no grand surrenders. There was only the steady, relentless sound of human tools cutting, grinding, and dismantling the remains of a century of certainty. The Verti had come to Earth to start an era of conquest. Instead, they had provided the world with its most profitable salvage project in history. Kelrin closed his eyes. He could still hear the 60 hertz hum of the ship, but it was being drowned out by the sound of human hammers. Earth hadn't beaten them with superior fire. They had beaten them with a superior work ethic. The high strategist realized then that the Coalition would never return. Not because they were afraid of the soldiers, but because they couldn't afford the bill for the cleanup. The salvage claim is secured. Smash the like button if you prefer human industry over alien empires. Subscribe to join our next deep space recovery mission. New data logs uploading soon.